Welcome, I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist, Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. The year is almost at a close, and what a year it has been, again. Let's review 2021 through a foreign affairs lens. Welcome, Robert.
Morena, Bruce.
I recall before the first lockdown last year, you saying this could be a black swan event, unexpected and with huge consequences, and how right that proved to be. Looking at this past year, how has the COVID-19 pandemic continued to shape global relations?
Well, that's a big question, isn't it? I think analysts are still divided, and diplomats are still divided on the trajectory of global politics after, well, we're still living through COVID-19, but what will it mean for the future? And there are those divided between the world essentially returning to an entity which is governed by nation states, and those who argue that globalization, this process of technologically driven interconnectedness, which is making the world seem a smaller place, argue that globalization has been turbocharged by COVID-19 and there'll be no return to the world as it was before COVID-19. And I think the jury's out. In my view, I think the evidence suggests we are moving into a new era, and in which people are becoming increasingly sensitized that many of the problems, like COVID-19 is just the latest in a long line of challenges that all nations face, which do not respect borders. We only have to think about the challenge presented after 9/11 by transnational terrorism. We only have to think about the challenge brought about by the global financial crisis. These problems are systemic in nature, and they can't be solved by players or actors, however big they are. These problems are too big for any one state to deal with it. And as I said before, the logical solution is for concerted international action to solve these problems. These problems are not going to go away, they're going to proliferate in the 21st century. So we face some tough choices in the not too distant future, and there is a bit of a tension internationally between those who insist, and these are the great powers, China and the United States, insist on leading international solutions, and what I call the rest, the middle powers and the small powers, who are increasingly seeing that these problems can't be solved without their participation and demanding a say.
Which two other events would you single out as significant for global foreign affairs during this past year?
I think two come readily to mind. We could probably list others, but I think the Glasgow Climate Conference, or COP26, was a significant event. These conferences organised by the UN have been held every 5 years. This year, there seemed to be a degree of seriousness that we've previously not had. Not least, I think, because the indications globally of how human activity, i.e. carbon dioxide emissions, are affecting our climate and our environment are multiplying. We are having increasing cases of extreme weather all around the world. And so I think there was a clarity of focus that we've previously lacked. This was manifested in two ways. Firstly, a number of countries in what's called the nationally determined targets for reducing their emissions have, if you like, updated their targets, and these include countries like Russia and India, but also New Zealand. And New Zealand has by 2030 pledged to cut half of the, if you like, its global pollution or its contribution of emissions from carbon dioxide. So that's quite a radical step for this country. We're trying to make up for lost ground. We also saw a number of countries, including New Zealand, increase their contributions to bringing about the reduction to 1.5 degrees of carbon dioxide emissions. But, many critics were, another thing here was, as I mentioned, Bruce, this UN meeting on climate occurs every 5 years. Next year they're having another one, which means they're going to have another bite of the cherry. And for some people that shows that we still have not made enough progress, but for others it shows that there is a seriousness of purpose. And let's face it, we're facing nothing less than a major, probably the biggest paradigm shift in energy use in the next decade. if we are going to get through this problem, which is, it's a bit like COVID-19. Climate change is a looming problem. No nation can solve it on its own. And kicking and screaming, countries are going to have to work together to get through this problem if human life as we know it on this planet is going to survive, not just human life either.
So that's COVID-19 and climate change. Is there one other thing that you would single out?
Yeah, the other thing was, Bruce, that we marked the 20th anniversary of 9/11. So it was a bit of a stock take, I think, around the world. And it was interesting to me that the United States, almost 20 years to the day that it launched its war on terror after the shocking attack against the Twin Towers and the Pentagon in 11 September 2001 by Al-Qaeda. 20 years later, where it all began in Afghanistan, they launched a military operation within a month of 9/11 in 2001. They wound down that operation and evacuated their forces in somewhat humiliating circumstances. So the United States did not prevail in Afghanistan. I think the international presence did make a lot of long-term differences to the country, but the grim reality is the Taliban, the ally of Al-Qaeda, and still the ally of Al-Qaeda, have seized power, and the United States and its allies were unable to prevent that. So that's sobering, 20 years on. And what does this mean for the problem of international terrorism? It's got wider. It's proliferated, despite the United States spending $8 trillion and fighting 2 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. We've seen the problem of international terrorism widen. We've got not only Al-Qaeda, which now has more fighters in the field than it did in 2001, far more. We also have the emergence of Islamic State, which has lost its territorial base but remains, as we've seen recently with the terrorist attack in New Lynn in this country, a potent force for attracting followers via the social media. So they're still carrying out attacks around the world. And of course, the other thing which directly impacted on New Zealand, we've seen the emergence of white supremacist terrorism, which affected us, of course, shockingly, in March 2019. So the problem has got worse rather than better. Now, some people say, and I saw this argument in the United States, oh yes, but the war on terror hasn't been a complete success. But overall, it's worked because we prevented another 9/11 attack on the United States. Well, I think the viewers will have to work out for themselves what they think is the better argument. But to me, I think in many respects, the political causes of terrorism have not really been addressed, and what's happened has been predominantly a military response led by the United States. So we've been treating the symptoms rather than the causes, and the evidence, as a result of that mismatch, we've now had a widening of the problem rather than a diminishment of it.
Has New Zealand's place in the world changed during the past 12 months?
I think so. I mean, China has loomed large on the New Zealand foreign policy radar. In a way, it's been a very important economic partner for us since we signed that free trade agreement in 2008. And New Zealand, this is interesting, New Zealand continues to distinguish itself from its closest allies in the way that it conducts its response to China, its diplomatic response to China and its activities. I think we had the evidence only last week. I think Wednesday last week, New Zealand's Defence Ministry made one of its toughest statements ever on China and said China was threatening, and they are the words used, China was threatening the rules-based order in the Pacific, a region where 70% of our development aid goes to, a crucial region for us. And also, the statement added that Chinese activities could tip the balance of power in the region. So I think New Zealand is taking a nuanced approach to China, but has no illusions about the challenges presented by China's rise to power globally and in the Pacific in particular.
Thank you for your insight again this year, Robert.
Oh, thanks, Bruce. It was a pleasure.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next year on Global Insight. Te pono me te araha.